The title here of today's talk is Shop Class as Soulcraft, and I'll give you a brief biography here of our featured keynote speaker. Matthew B. Crawford is a senior fellow at the University of Virginia's Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture and a New York Times best-selling author. He studied physics as an undergraduate, then history of political thought, earning a PhD from the University of Chicago. His books include Shop Class as Soulcraft, The World Beyond Your Head, and Why We Drive. And his shorter writings have appeared in First Things, The Wall Street Journal, The New Atlantis, Hedgehog Review, Unheard, Compact, and his Substack, Arcadelia. So without further ado, Dr. Crawford, come on up. We'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. My cold has gone from bad to worse overnight, so this is what it's going to sound like, I'm afraid. Maybe I'll just say a word about how the book came to be. I hadn't set out to write this book. Like it just kind of happened, and the way it, I guess the animating thought was that I've had a lot of different kind of jobs, white collar jobs. And then like working as an electrician and a mechanic. And my work experience didn't seem to fit the official story that we were telling ourselves about work. One element of that is that I often found myself more challenged intellectually doing mechanical work than in some of the well, I had a think tank job, for example. Now, I'll try to get at why that was the case. And at the same time, I was noticing changes in material culture that make it harder to, sorry, there's my opening slide. I'm going to be skipping some slides because this is like a condensed version of a longer presentation. So that'll be a little distracting. But I was noticing changes in material culture that make it harder to be self-reliant, harder to be master of your own stuff. There's a design philosophy that's emerged where the point seems to be to hide the works. So for example, if you lift the hood on some cars now, what you're likely to see is something like this. Essentially, there's another hood under the hood, as though the sight of an alternator might offend us somehow. Some high-end cars now don't even have a dipstick. So you couldn't check your own oil level if you wanted to. Instead, I think you're sent an email from somewhere if your oil level gets low. And I can't be the only person who's a little bit creeped out by that. Now, it used to be that in addition to a dipstick, you had something called an idiot light. And it was called an idiot light for a reason. We had a harsh judgment of anyone who is so uninvolved in his own car that he let it get to the point that the light is coming on. But there's some weird cultural logic whereby idiocy, that is a lack of involvement, gets recast as something desirable, as an indication of technological progress. Yeah. Oh, no, I have slides, blank ones on purpose, no worries. Anyway, so it's sort of taken as an indication of technological progress. And of course, it is a kind of progress when you no longer have to mess around with dipsticks and dirty rags and all that. But I also want to just notice that there is a kind of moral education that is tacit in technology, and it can go in various directions. The way things are going currently, it often feels like the modern personality is getting reformed in the direction of passivity and dependence. There are just fewer occasions to be directly responsible for your own physical environment. And with that, I think, comes less expectation of responsibility. If you're over a certain age, and a few of you are, you might remember that the Sears catalog used to include these blown up parts diagrams for all the appliances they sold. And by the way, raise your hand if you know what this is. Okay, I've shown this slide to some like Gen Z audiences and like, what is it? So it was just taken for granted that this kind of information would be demanded by the consumer, who expected to own an appliance for a long time and wanted to know that parts were available and such. Whereas now, let's say your washing machine goes on the fritz. Well, even if you're the kind of person who's comfortable with basic stuff like motors and solenoids and relays, you might well feel daunted from taking on the job just because of all the layers of electronic BS, frankly, that get piled on top of machines, sort of gratuitously. And besides, time is money, right? So it often makes more sense from a narrow economic perspective to just get a new one and send the old one off to a landfill, even though it's probably some $10 part that's gone bad. Now, you can criticize that decision from the perspective of sustainability and environmentalism, and I think those are important arguments to make. But the argument I want to make is different. It's really about the effects on the individual. Because I think this kind of learned helplessness leaves us bereft of something that's really at the core of being human, and that is individual agency. By that, I just mean the experience of seeing a direct effect of your actions in the world and knowing that these actions are genuinely your own. And I want to highlight this idea because I think it's one of the sort of hallmark features of modern life that we often feel like we're moving in these kind of channels that have been projected from afar by vast impersonal forces that are very hard to understand. Some of us worry that we're actually becoming stupider and begin to wonder if getting an adequate grasp on the world intellectually may actually depend on getting a handle on it in some literal and active sense. I think that's why shop class in schools is important. It's why tinkering is important. These are ways that a young person begins to make his or her world intelligible. And by contrast, if you don't feel that you can have an effect on the world, you're not likely to feel responsible for it. And then it becomes perfectly understandable to check out into a virtual world, right? And playing video games, you blow stuff up and you get blown up and then you just hit reset and there are no real consequences to your actions. Unlike, say, wiring a house, where if you get it wrong enough, it will actually burn down. I'm going to skip a few slides showing different kinds of work and get to this one. Working in an office, it's often difficult to see any tangible results from your actions. What exactly have you accomplished at the end of any given day? Where the chain of cause and effect is opaque and responsibility tends to get spread around, the experience of individual agency can be a little bit elusive. And it turns out there's some great sociological literature on middle managers. And the picture that emerges is that they tend to feel quite insecure in their jobs. Now, let's say you're a carpenter and you have a problem with your boss. Well, you can say to him, it's plumb, it's level, and it's square. Go check it yourself. But when you don't have appeal to concrete objective standards like that, you're never quite sure where you stand. And so you have to spend a lot of your time managing what others think of you. There's a lot of sort of walking on eggshells, and the office can be a fairly paranoid place as compared to the job site. And there's any number of pop culture items that kind of get at that. So Dilbert, there's a fantastic movie called Office Space. It's really funny. So these are portrayals of cubicle life that attest to a dark absurdism with which many people come to view their white-collar jobs. So I want to speak up for the skilled manual trades and suggest that can be a life that's worth choosing. So why would that even need to be said? I think it does need to be said because we've developed an educational monoculture in this country where almost every kid feels pressure to go to college and get on a certain track where you end up working in an office. So high school shop class programs were widely dismantled in the 90s. To make room for computer classes, we had this idea that somehow we're going to be gliding around in a pure information economy. But the truth is that some people, including some who are plenty smart, would rather be learning to build things or fix things. So why not honor that? Now, sometimes we do praise people who do work that is straightforwardly useful. But the praise often betrays an assumption that they had no other options. We idealize them as the salt of the earth and emphasize the sacrifice for others that their work may entail. And of course, such sacrifice does indeed occur. So think of the hazards faced by a lineman restoring power during a storm. But what if such work answers as well to a basic human need of the one who does it? I take that to be the suggestion of this very nice poem by Marge Piercy, which ends with these lines. The pitcher longs for water to carry, and a person for work that is real. So I wonder if beneath our gratitude to the lineman is something quite different, something more like envy. Here's somebody doing something that is possible to take seriously. And that's not always the case in a job. I'm going to skip over the economic case for the trades and get to, well, I guess I will just tell you a little bit of my own story. So I graduated from UC Santa Barbara, big state school, in 1989 with a degree in physics, and moved to LA to look for work in aerospace. So I sent out dozens of resumes and got essentially zero response. This was during the big downturn in defense spending, so that's how it was. And after about 4 or 5 months, my savings were gone, and I found myself going around the parking lot of a home improvement store, putting flyers on the windshields of cars to advertise my services as an electrician. This is work I had done all through high school and college in the summers. So the flyers said, unlicensed but careful. And I got immediate response. There was more demand for my services as an unlicensed electrician than as a credentialed college graduate. And I was glad to have something to fall back on. So I went into business for myself doing that illegally. And doing that work, I never ceased to take pleasure in this moment that would come at the end of the job when I would flip the switch and the lights would come on. It was an experience of agency and competence. I would say, and there was light. I liked that. So the effects of my work were visible, literally visible for all to see, which meant that my competence was real for others as well. It had a kind of social currency. Now, I was sometimes quieted at the sight of a gang of conduit entering a big panel bent into these nestled flowing curves with varying offsets that somehow all terminate in the same plane. So look especially in the upper right-hand corner. Those are some bends. And this was a skill so far beyond my abilities that I felt like I was in the presence of some genius, and that whoever bent that conduit probably imagined this moment of recognition, as he did it, that someone at some point would come along to appreciate it for what it is, which, is a kind of work of art. And by the way, the guy who bent this conduit, his name is Denny Kaye. And there he is with his pipe bender. So as a residential and light commercial electrician, most of my work got covered up inside of walls. But still, I felt pride in meeting, I guess you'd call it the aesthetic demands of a workmanlike installation. Maybe another electrician would come along and open up the wall and see it, and I didn't want to be embarrassed at the thought of that. But even if not, I felt responsible to my better self, or better yet, to the thing itself. Craftsmanship has been said to consist in the desire to do something right for its own sake. If the primary satisfaction is intrinsic and private in that way, there's nonetheless a sort of self-disclosing that takes place. There's a philosopher named Alexander Kojève who said, you recognize your own product in a world that's actually been transformed by your work. You recognize yourself in it. You discover and also reveal to others an objective reality that was at first only subjective inside you. The satisfactions of manifesting oneself concretely in the world through manual competence have been known to make a person quiet and easy. They seem to relieve him of the felt need to offer chattering interpretations of himself to vindicate his worth. He can simply point. The building stands. The car now runs. The lights are on. He doesn't have a need for a sign like this one. Determined worker, intense, good worker, hard worker, terrific. So the well-founded pride of the tradesman or tradeswoman is far from the gratuitous self-esteem that educators are often told they should impart to students as though by magic, as though it's the kind of thing you could just confer upon someone. It's also quite far from the anxiousness that Dwight captures so well. If you're an electrician, either you can bend conduit or you can't, and the fact is plain for all to see. So you have some solid ground to stand on in your own self-assessment, and it's the same ground on which others will assess you. Okay. Some people get hustled off to college and then to the cubicle against their own natural inclinations and natural bents, when they'd rather be learning to build things or fix things. There's a woodshop teacher named Doug Stowe who also writes very eloquently about his work as a shop teacher. He said, in schools we create artificial learning environments for our children that they know to be contrived and undeserving of their full attention. Without the opportunity to learn through their hands, the world remains abstract and distant, and the passions for learning will not be engaged. And I don't think that's true of every student, but it's true of enough students that we ought to worry about it. A gifted young person who chooses, let's say, to become a mechanic rather than accumulate academic credentials is viewed as eccentric, maybe even self-destructive. There's a pervasive anxiety among parents that there's only one track to success for their children, and it runs through a series of gates controlled by prestigious institutions. And of course, there's also wide use of psychiatric drugs to medicate boys in particular against their natural bent toward action, the better to keep things on track, as the school nurse says. I'm picturing Nurse Ratched, if you. And this serves the interests of educators in preserving their own sanity, which I know because I taught high school for a year. I tried to anyway. And I would have loved to have had like a Ritalin fogger in the classroom just to maintain order, you know, because it's a rare person, male or female, who's naturally inclined to sit still for 16 years in school and then indefinitely at work. Interestingly, things are quite different in Germany. At least they were, you know, it was almost 20 years ago now. I was researching and writing this book. Something like 60% of 16-year-olds were entering an apprenticeship program. They just have a very different culture of work and education there. And in Germany, a smart and ambitious 16-year-old might imagine himself becoming, say, a prototype machinist at Mercedes-Benz. And that's a respectable aspiration to have. In the States, apprenticeship is often criticized for being too narrow in education. It's said that what's wanted in the job market is people with sort of ready to reinvent themselves at any time. Don't get too ingrown in any particular skill set, but you have to be ready to reinvent yourself at any time. But it bears thinking about that when you go deep into some particular skill, it trains your powers of perception. You become more discerning about these particular objects, whatever they are. And if all goes well, you get initiated into an ethic of caring about what you're doing. Usually that's by the example set by some mentor who exemplifies that spirit of craftsmanship. So I guess I want to say that technical training, though it's certainly narrow in its immediate application, can be understood as part of education in the broadest sense, namely intellectual and moral formation. I'm going to skip a bunch here. So I had a job as director of a think tank in Washington, D.C., which I quit after 5 months because I couldn't stand it, and I opened a motorcycle repair shop in Richmond, Virginia. Now, the think tank job sometimes required me to reason backwards from some desired conclusion to a suitable premise, because you need to arrive at the conclusion that your funders are looking for, basically. It was a policy place, and it had taken certain positions, and there were some facts that we were more fond of than other facts, let's say. As its figurehead, I was making arguments I didn't fully buy myself, and this was demoralizing. Further, my boss seemed intent on retraining me according to a certain cognitive style, I'll call it. It was that of the corporate world, which he had recently come from. This style demanded that I project an image of rationality, and that's very important, but not indulge too much in actual reasoning, because it could lead you off in the wrong direction. By contrast, in fixing motorcycles, you answer to standards that aren't open to manipulation in that way. Either the bike starts and runs right, or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, there's no weaseling your way out of the fact. And I like that about it. The work is often frustrating, but it's never irrational. You could say the BS quotient is low, unless you're dealing with Harley owners. And it's all about the costume with those guys. So, almost done here. I'm going to skip some stuff here. I guess That was my shop in Richmond, Virginia. Where am I here? All right. Since you guys are classical educators, I think this is getting closer to your own concerns now. Mechanical work requires you to cultivate certain intellectual habits. Further, habits of mind have an ethical dimension that we don't often think about. So good diagnosis requires attentiveness to the machine, almost a conversation with it, rather than assertiveness as in, a think tank on K Street. The cognitive psychologists speak of metacognition, which is the activity of stepping back and thinking about your own thinking. Is what you do when you stop for a minute in your pursuit of a solution and wonder whether your understanding of the problem is adequate. So for example, the slap of worn-out pistons hitting their cylinders can sound quite a bit like loose valve tappets. So to be a good mechanic, you have to be constantly open to the possibility that you may be mistaken. That's a virtue that is at once cognitive and ethical, I want to say. It seems to develop because the mechanic, if he's the sort who goes on to become good at it, internalizes the well-working of the motorcycle as an object of passionate concern. I don't know how else you could explain the elation you feel when you identify the root cause of some problem. Those are the best moments. This active concern for the motorcycle is reinforced by the social aspects of the job. So like many independent mechanics, my business was based entirely on word of mouth, which I would sometimes barter services with metal fabricators and machinists. And that has a very different feel than transactions with money. It situates you in a community. And one result of that is that I really didn't want to screw up anybody's bike or charge more than a fair price. Because, people know. You often hear people complain about mechanics and other people in the trades whom they take to be dishonest or incompetent. And I'm sure there's plenty of that. But it's also true that the mechanic deals with a large element of chance that can be hard to appreciate if you've never done that kind of work. I once accidentally dropped the feeler gauge down into the crankcase of a Kawasaki Ninja. This is his first scheduled valve adjustment, so it was practically brand new. And on this occasion, I thought I was going to have to completely tear down this motor. That would have been a disaster. But I escaped having to do that only through an operation that involved the use of a stethoscope, another pair of trusted hands, and the sort of concentration that we associate with a bomb squad. And when I finally laid my fingers on that feeler gauge, I felt like I had cheated death. I don't ever remember feeling so alive as in the hours that followed. But often as not, such crises do not end in redemption. Moments of elation are counterbalanced with failures. And these too are vivid. They take place right before your eyes. With stakes that are often high and immediate. Speaking of which, one time my shopmate forgot to tighten the nuts holding the axle on the front wheel of a bike, and the guy got, halfway home and came back complaining of a shaking. Yeah, somebody could get hurt. With stakes that are often high and immediate, the manual trades elicit heedful absorption in one's work. They're punctuated by moments of pleasure that take place against a darker backdrop, which is a keen awareness of catastrophe as an always present possibility. The core experience is one of individual responsibility, and this gets cashed out in face-to-face interactions between a tradesperson and their customer. By way of concluding, I would say a good job is one, the distinction here is not actually between working with your hands or working in an office. That is less important here. It's one that has a field of action where you can put your best capacities to work and see an effect in the world. And academic credentials don't always guarantee that. So I would say that educators who want to steer young people toward work that has the kind of intellectual and social richness I've tried to describe can do that in part by rehabilitating the manual trades as an option based on a firmer grasp of what that kind of work is actually like. But now doing that would take courage, because any high school principal who doesn't at least claim as his goal 100% college attendance is likely to be accused of harboring low expectations and run out of town by indignant parents. And that indignation is hard to stand against because it has all the sort of moral heft of egalitarianism, right? Everyone should go to college. Yet it's also snobbish, paradoxically, insofar as it regards the trades as a low expectation. I want to suggest, this is the thought I'll leave you with, that the best sort of democratic education would be neither snobbish nor egalitarian. Rather, it would give a place of honor in our common life to whatever is best. And at this weird moment of growing passivity and dependence, why don't we publicly recognize what's really a kind of yeoman aristocracy among us? I mean those who gain real knowledge of real things, the kind that we all depend on every day. Thank you.